Hello, everyone. Welcome back. So, we're doing our tour of qualitative research designs. And um, the next design we're going to talk about is grounded theory. Now, if you think about quantitative research claims that there's the claim that it can um, this is where theories come from, right? So you have, it's this whole mathematics and astronomy and basic sciences from the natural world, right? And so physics and so on, where there are rules and laws and eventually theories, and so maybe there's this grand unified theory that relates to the motion of the cosmos. Well, can there be a grand unified theory that relates to um, people and people's experiences? And that's the kind of thing that grounded theory is trying to tackle from a qualitative approach. But some would say that grounded theory is can be seen as a more positivistic method rather than interpretivistic, because the idea is that you're going to get all this data until you find out the truth, okay, some truth, some universal truth about something, a general explanation of a process or an action, okay. The theory is grounded in data from participants. So this is not something we're just thinking and deducing. We're not just sitting under the apple tree and having the apple fall on our head and, oh, gravity. No, we're getting data from participants. And Glaser and Strauss are credited with discovering and describing grounded theory. Um, now, uh, Eventually they kind of had a falling out about what how grounded theory should be done. And so there are kind of different flavors of grounded theory as a result. So we get this idea of it as being a theory on what is actually true in the world, grounded in data from participants, through to it being seen as you may not be discovering the truth about the world, some universal truth, but it is a structured way of doing data analysis. And to this idea that it can be constructivist grounded theory, and you can incorporate kind of a situational perspective as other options, depending on the flavor of grounded theory you're doing. So, some defining features: you're focusing on a process or action with distinct steps or phases that occur over time. Okay, you're trying to understand how something occurs. And I guess an example I think of is the school to prison pipeline, for example. There's are very distinct steps. Okay, any of the pipeline ideas. It could be school to college. It could be the teacher pipeline. How do we recruit and retain teachers? There's something that follows discrete steps or phases that occur over time. Okay, we're going to develop a theory on this process or this action. Um, we're going to memo our ideas during the data connection collection and analysis. Okay, this idea of memoing, writing memos to yourself, is very important in qualitative research. And you have this simultaneous and iterative data collection. Usually it's interviews, okay, and analysis. You're interviewing and analyzing, interviewing, analyzing, interviewing, analyzing, interviewing, analyzing, because you're trying to reach a point where you've found all the different permutations and all the different things that how they relate and all the different elements of this process. And to do that, you need to see when what you're learning starts to repeat, what you're hearing starts to repeat itself. And so you're in the process, you you're not just doing the analysis at the end. It's um, embedded in the process. The data analysis can be highly structured. There's something called open coding and axial coding and selective coding, or it can be less structured. Okay, but the classic form of grounded theory is highly structured. This systematic or classic form of grounded theory is that you have a unit of information, that you have this category. It can be an event, a type of event. It could happenings, instances. You do this theoretical sampling where you're doing multiple passes to the field until your categories are saturated, until you feel like you fully defined this category. It's a constant comparative method of analysis where you're comparing your new to your existing categories. So, is this a subset of that? Is this in parallel with that? Does this supersede that? Kind of comparing your categories, and then an idea of a conditional matrix. So you see that there are these terms that are related to the process of doing the data collection and analysis. So the coding, all right, open coding for the main categories. In axial coding, you're identifying the core phenomenon. Here's this phenomenon idea again. From the open codes, you're figuring out causal conditions, and I always think of arrows. What's leading to what? The factors that are causing the core phenomenon, the strategies or the actions in response to the core phenomenon, intervening conditions, the broad situational factors, and the quantitative analog would be moderators and mediators. The consequences or outcomes of various strategies. And then axial coding, you visually model this core and surrounding categories. Okay, like think of on a car tire has these axes. And selective coding, you're developing propositions or hypotheses. Now, that's the kind of like that was the classical type. On the other kind of end of the spectrum, there's the constructivist type. And the constructivist type does not start with the assumption that there is a universal truth that we're going to discover through analyzing participant interviews. Um, it allows for the possibility that there are diverse local worlds and multiple realities. And so it's more interpretivistic, okay? And the guidelines are more flexible. One of the things that is talked about in the terms of the constructivist type is we're making visible hierarchies of power. Also, it's not just about this leading to that, but there may be different hierarchies of power that influence the school to prison pipeline, for example. We want to get at the beliefs, the feelings, and the ideologies of participants. So, more of a focus on the participants rather than on the methods of how we're doing this. And and so we're going to not be uh, using inaccessible terms, complex inaccessible terms. That uh, if I were trying to prove that qualitative research was as good as quantitative research, then I might want to use terms that few people understand because that's what quantitative research seems to do sometimes. But we don't necessarily do that as the constructivist perspective. Active codes are gerund based phrases, um, learning, teaching, running, hiding. those kinds of things. And conclusions are seen as incomplete and inconclusive because we did not find our 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 theory is not going to explain everything, is the constructivist perspective. uh, we 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 cannot find out everything about this process or this phenomenon, and so incomplete, inconclusive. So kind of more a postmodern feel in terms of procedures. First of all, as before, we're going to determine the suitability of this design for our needs. If you're and grounded theory is usually not what students do in a introductory or even intermediate level research class, because it actually does take quite a bit of time and quite a bit of data that you may not have access to. In fact, you probably don't when you're taking a research methods class, for example. You're going to focus the interview or interviews on how individuals experience whatever the process is that they've gone through. You're going to do theory building through this iterative data collection. I collect the data, I analyze it, I write a memo. I collect the data, I analyze it, I write a memo. First, you're going to do open coding and figure out the categories and what their properties are. Then axial coding, some kind of logical diagram. This is where you're getting your arrows with the central phenomenon, the causes and intervening conditions, and the consequences. And then finally, your substantive level theory. So you're going to have a model. The classic classic grounded theory, there'll always be a model in the paper, a conceptual model that shows what the analysis found. The constructivist type, there may or may not be a model, a diagram, because there's this idea, well, we can't find out everything, and this isn't the last word on this process. So I'm not necessarily going to write it out in this kind of highly prescriptive way. But that all depends um, on how the researcher is approaching the study. I like conceptual models, even if they are tentative. Some of the challenges of grounded theory is that you have to set aside pre-existing theoretical ideas, because otherwise you're just going to be trying to fit your data into the ideas you have, and you want to allow the substantive theory to emerge. Now you're going to be following specific steps if you're using the Corbin and Strauss method. And also, sometimes it can be hard to determine when categories are saturated, like when you know everything there is to know about a particular category. And because if you talk to somebody from a slightly different perspective, maybe they would say something different, right? You producing a theory with specific components can be hard. Again, the data might not fit into the classical or systematic scheme. And if you're where you're feeling like you need more flexibility, or your topic warrants more flexibility, or your own philosophical orientation says that a more flexible ways the way to go, then the Charmaz approach is actually the one you want to use. Okay, so that's a little bit about grounded theory. Okay, see you next time.